conference, and whether or not you're from Moodle-Sloan, we're really happy that you are.
Is kind of a version of multimedia that we call paper spaces. What we'll be doing is I'll be walking through the mural with you as a way to introduce Valerie and Doug, and we'll be asking you to do a little bit of an interactive exercise, and then we'll have a conversation with Doug that will involve you as well. Now I want to invite you to kind of walk on up if you want to come closer, because I'm going to be walking through the mural. You will be able to see it on the up there, but if you'd like to walk up here, we'd enjoy having you come up a little bit closer. So anybody feel like moving up? Drift up? Okay, well I hope you'll be able to follow it there. So what's the idea? And so many things came out of that didn't even have names at the time that we know of today, including social networking. We had the mouse, Windows, hyperlinks, online publishing, collaborative document sharing. I'll let you tell more, Valerie, about that. Valerie will be explaining this in more detail. The idea is to have a look not just at the technology, but at the vision behind the technology. It was a very robust philosophy that Doug has that gave rise to more than the technologies, but what he called the co-evolution of tools and technologies. So what's been important about working with Doug, Valerie's been working with Doug for 20 years, and I've been working with them for 5 or 6, working on the book and the mural. Doug talks about dialogue, that a philosophy doesn't exist in a vacuum, but it emerges as people talk together, work together, and develop their ideas together in collaboration. So the mural is a way that we have of really showing that idea that Doug called co-evolution. Co-evolution of tools, human systems and tool systems, or you might say culture and technology. So let me go through this, because in looking at the big picture and the history, that will help us frame what's happening now in a larger context. So right now, we see so much happening with social networks, and so many people connected in so many ways. But what's behind that? And more importantly, how can we get to the dream of collective intelligence? Not just being connected, but collectively working together to solve global problems, which we'll hear more about. That's kind of the big idea here. So how that works, and I have to forgive me for kind of turning around here. And again, if you want to come up, that would be great. This is a map that includes many, many streams of information. So when we talk about culture, people, and tools, what are we talking about? Well, I'm just going to read through the key here. So the key to this map are major big era shifts. For example, back in the 30s, Fordism, everything being faster, better, cheaper. That was sort of a dominating idea of the day. We have high impact events, World War II, obviously, the atomic bomb, things that were happening. Those are up here in these little splotches. So we see what's happening politically, global events. And then we have also, for example, quotes that were kind of indicative of what people were thinking at the time. Big events that show up in these clouds. Sorry, not big events. Big events are the splotches. Those are big ideas that kind of bubbled up. Today that would be Web 2.0, for example, or about 5 years ago when that happened. So these are ideas in the big clouds that probably foreshadowed what was happening in technology. So let me give you some examples of big shifts. I mean, see these purple arrows, Deming and quality control. That was a big idea in business that's really informed a lot of our culture as well in education. But since this is an education group, I think it's especially important to look at ideas like, we would not have thought this, that dynamic media and systems thinking was in the 40s. That's when that began. So a lot of the work that you're doing now has its kind of intellectual roots back then. So moving forward, I want to move back really quickly, because since you're working in technology, there were ideas about how people could be translated into technology. So back in the day, 1932, in AI, artificial intelligence, people were thought to be rational, like computers. So you could somehow program computers to think like people. Of course, we don't think that anymore. We know much more complex. So let's move forward to 1945, and a Vannevar Bush article, As We May Think, that really affected Doug's ideas. So what was happening in the world at that time? To put that together, I mean, the time of the atomic bomb is when people were starting to put together ideas about how we might solve global problems with technology. So the intellectual roots go back to there. And this big vision we'll hear a little bit more about. Let's look down at inventions. IBM shipped the first electronic computer in the early 1950s. We have the ARPANET. So I love this part in the 60s. We had the Summer of Love and the moon landing and all that money coming in for science and education. And that was all around the time that there were so many changes in culture, even in business. Business ethics wasn't really a big thing until maybe the late 60s. So the ideas, that came out of philosophy, like, well, here we have cognitive psychology. So the idea of studying the human brain as a way to help people, as opposed to back in the day of Freud. So this is beginning to show us a way of looking at thoughts and people in a different way. In the meantime, all this is happening in technology. The big demo, the first network that in 71, the foreshadow of the internet, the ARPANET, FinSurf. Then moving ahead, here's one of the few things I have on this map that shows, or I should say we, because this was a joint effort, not just Valerie and Doug and me, but really dozens of people, maybe hundreds at this point, who added. So we put in the well here, and it's rare. This is a rare one in that we have the image from the key of a group of people standing in a circle, being collaborative. So we have a technology start coming together. You'll like this, I think. The whole idea of lifelong learning just became popular not that long ago in the 90s. People realized that learning was continuous. And jumping into this area, another really wonderful thing about the map, and you'll be able to see this also online, is that you can see things aggregated. You can see when a lot starts happening philosophically. So right around early 2000, we don't have as many big technology developments that changed the world as we had earlier. So the size of the river tells you how much was happening. But so much happening in the world, the way that we live and the way we think. Globalization, social networking goes mainstream, Web 2.0, the blogosphere. So all this is happening in the early 2000s. And what we're going to kind of play with a little bit today is now we have this culture of collaboration, we have all this amazing technology, and we have this wave at the end that we don't know how that's going to come together. So that's what we're looking at today.
So after studying Douglas Engelbart's ideas for about 20 years, first as from a multimedia perspective, I was a multimedia developer and then a professor of multimedia. Since in the 1960s, Doug developed the notion of hypermedia and multimedia as a digital format. I was looking at his work from that perspective. And then in 2002, he approached me and another professor, Angie Cooksey, from what was it, University of Indiana, or Indiana University, sorry, forgot. And we got together to try and teach online through teleconferencing and blogs and online discussion Engelbart's vision. She from a philosophical framework, because she was a professor of philosophy, and myself and my students were implementing the multimedia aspects. And so that's when I really started getting into applied Engelbart. So how do we apply both a philosophical framework to an actual technological output? And so some of the tenets of Doug's framework proved to be way more powerful than I had imagined. So before that, I was sort of a believer. But when we actually moved into applying Engelbart, so using his framework to study his framework, what happened was the students were able to bootstrap on each other's knowledge. And so we had students who all of a sudden went from asking the question, are there any questions and complex problems? And that you could not solve the same problems you created with the same mindset. And Albert Einstein was also thinking the same thing, and he has a very similar quote, that we can't solve the problems we have with the same mindset in which we created them. So he was thinking, how can we create a system to address the urgent and complex problems? Because when you go to solve any one problem, whether it be hunger, pollution, the disparity between rich and poor, war, etc., anytime you go to solve one single complex problem, you notice that it creates a whole series of new problems. And so he came up with this vision for augmenting human intellect. So just in the way that our other cultural tools, such as the hoe, augments our ability to plant crops and engage in agriculture, how can the new intellectual worker use tools to augment their ability? Now, of course, we've had several augmentation tools for hundreds of years, including paper and print. But with the new digital, in those days, not even digital, right? The whole emerging field. So when Doug in 1951 first came up with his vision, there was something like 7 computers in the entire world. And he had read one popular book on computing. But he had this idea that if the radar screens could map information visually, that same technology could be used to map what a computer output was, and that we could link all the computers together in the world and view the information via screens and create a network of information to solve complex and urgent problems in a complex way, rather than finding simple solutions that then created new problems that were often bigger than the problems they were originally solving, right? Is that something that resonates with you? And so that this way you could collectively combine intelligence and augment human abilities to think and problem solve. And this has been a driving vision. So this is my editorial comment, right? But because of Sputnik, actually Eileen's husband James Clegg was just talking about this. He's a scientist that in the 60s, because of Sputnik, the United States invested so much money in science out of fear of the Soviet Union that thankfully Doug was funded in 1962 to write a seminal paper called, oh boy, I just blanked out on the name.
A conceptual framework.
A conceptual framework, thank you. Augmenting Human Intellect, a conceptual framework. And in this paper, he lays out what I argue, and I hope somebody challenges me on this. I argue that he lays out the foundations for every single tool we have today in the computer science field. So he even maps out, in this paper he maps out the notion of hypertext, of hypermedia, of social networks, of a form of blogging, a form of wikis. 3D conceptual maps is one of the parts that I would really love to see somebody work on, because he says one of the problems with our symbolic thinking is that our symbolic thinking, meaning writing, our alphabet and the way we deal with the text media is in a linear format. So once you go into a digital format, we may need to transform our symbols and have much more adaptable symbols for this much more adaptable format. Like, why is it that, a web page has to pretty much mirror a print page? That we weren't able to adapt the medium for the new media. One of Doug's ideas is that as part of designing this collective, collaborative augmentation system to augment humans' ability to solve problems, there needs to be, one of the problems that we have is our silo thinking. I'm sure this is, something all the universities are addressing. So each discipline has their own silo of information, of jargon, etc., right? Their own way of, their own methodology, their own language, their own library. And then it becomes very difficult, for instance, for a biology department to share information with the sociology department because the words are different. And even, for instance, in the world of medicine, the terminology is very different. In some fields of medicine, they might call it a fever, and in others, an elevated temperature. So how do people collaborate across silos? So Doug was saying people could form networks like this network that we have today, which is an improvement community, right? We're all here because we are all passionate about our field, and we want to improve the field of educational technology. So this is an improvement community. But rather than having sort of haphazard ways of communicating or having conferences like this and disseminating reports, what if we were in groups that were networked to solve specific problems, complex problems that we're facing? And that group, there was one level of the group in which we just focused on how do we solve this problem and how do we go about doing our daily work. And then the next level of the group, this next level of the network community, networked improvement community, looked at how the first level was doing their work and said, how can we improve their process? And then the third level is, on top of that, saying, well, how can the B-level group improve their improvement process? So it becomes a meta-improvement process, or a meta-networked improvement process. Community, excuse me. And so this idea of constantly improving your improvement process leads to an exponential, or the compounding of intellectual interest in a way. This group from during the early 60s, in 1968, his group is now considered the most prolific technology group in history. So that by 1968 they had invented hypertext, the mouse, one of the first to debut the screen, to use a keyboard with a computer, to have network computing, to have interactive video, audio, file sharing, email, Windows. The list goes on and on. And this early group, and it took almost 20 years before even the simplest part of Doug's, the technology he created was disseminated into the larger society, which was the mouse. I argue the reason that the mouse is the only artifact that was so sort of widely disseminated was because it had such an easy to say name. In those days, they didn't have the catchy terms, like all the technology. So his team at SRI actually used this process of constantly both evolving the tools as they were creating the tools. So the programmers could all, they had an incredible documentation system that's sort of wiki-like, where you can see who did what, when, and what changes were made. And this is in 1968, right? And so as the programmers were developing the tools, they were also discussing how they could improve the tools. So it was sort of this thing of, while you're creating the tools, you're also improving the tools that you're creating. And at the same time, you're looking at the process you're doing and figuring out how can we improve that. And then other people and yourself are also saying, wow, how can we improve this process of improving ourselves. And so that was the basic tenet. And then the other thing that was really important, actually, in Doug's ideas was the idea that because we're not dealing with a static medium, we should stop thinking about sort of viewing information in static formats. So you go to a web page and it looks just like a print page and you're scrolling through and searching and whatnot. Why not make dynamic views of information so that I could say, well, I'm looking at a 50-page report. How about just show me the first line of every paragraph? Well, how about I just want to see, the last line of every paragraph? Okay, how about the first and last line? How about different ways of thinking? How about color-coding text so that we can see the nouns and verbs in different colors and increase our speed of reading? Why not start playing with the medium so that we can augment our skills rather than just transferring from the print medium to the digital without really rethinking the power of the medium? So those were the things that have motivated me to study with Engelbart, and the work that our students produced and working with the whole group was then, after we started working, just Angie Cooksey and I, we got to be 8 scholars around the world, all working and teaching in this Engelbart paradigm, and the result was just exhilarating. And, students, undergraduate students went from kind of, wins the test to having a passion and doing prolific work. So, what I'd like you to do, in truly Engelbartian fashion, is meet with your neighbor, and if you're sitting all by yourself, it's okay, you don't have to move, but it would be great if you did. Because I'm a firm believer that if you literally get up and move, it changes your perspective. But what I'd like you to do is take a few minutes to meet with your neighbor, and if we kind of look at the historical context, I know it's a little bit far for some of you. Imagine, right, so if Engelbart in 68 could come out with email, network computing, online publishing, video conferencing, invention of the mouse, collaborative document sharing, et cetera, and really lay the foundation for the transformation of the knowledge age. How can we, the people in this room are educational technologists, so in your hands lays an incredible amount of potential. And all of you have really great ideas and really great intentions. So imagine, if you will, what can be this next wave of innovation? And what can you do as educational technologists to facilitate this great wave? So I'd like you to take just 5 minutes and write down some ideas and questions on paper, and we'll take a few samples and get dialogue from Doug and see what he has to say about those things as well. And I'd actually like you guys to stand up for a minute to write it, just to shake.
But anyway, when I came back and finished college and got excited enough about computers and got a chance to go to graduate school in the computer field, and it just one big thinking about, hey, that kind of technology could really help improve our ability to collect, integrate, and distribute knowledge, as well as boosting our ability for a real collaborative dialogue. And so that's when I came up with the ideas about computer links, and so you can have really all your ideas really linked together with a real network, and there's more things about your link. You have a quality about your link is why I'm linking to that point, and things even to say the potential value of this, or that this, we had to fix in some of our early electronics that you could see something and see that it was being linked to. You could see whom it was linking, who made the link. If you wanted to, you could trace back and see if the link had any comments on it, including it could say, well, see also this, so you could go see the also thing like this, so that it was just enriching very, very much the kind of ways in which the kind of dialogue and orientation of developing and integrating knowledge could develop. So I have great hopes that that's the way our world would evolve. And as I comment on it now, it gives me this funny feeling that I wonder whatever happened to that concept. Maybe some of you could tell me.
Okay, what I have is a scenario and then a question off the scenario. So in the future, a student might be using something like this, which is the latest Kindle, but maybe a little bit more powerful. And the students read an article, a paper, some slides from their class. They don't quite understand something. So they tap on their screen, and then somewhere else in the world, I don't know where, some other student or person or adult or yourself might be reading that same thing. And they are notified that someone else in the world has a question about this paper. They get connected. They start collaborating together efficiently. One person might be in India, the other person in Brazil. Maybe there's 50 people that say, hey, I can help you with that. So that's kind of the concept. Do you see that this type of collaboration might happen in the future? And what kind of technologies might we need to make that happen?
Well, the first thing I could think of is I feel sad that it hasn't happened already. And I don't think there's any, my intuition is that there isn't any real block to doing that technically. So why not, come on you guys, do it.
Do we have a final question? Yes, go ahead.
I'm curious what you think of Twitter and some of these latest social networking technologies and how significant something like Twitter is. And I'm sorry, I'm going to say that again. I'm Jeff Young with the Chronicle of Higher Education. I'm curious what you think of Twitter specifically and maybe generally some of these other social technologies that have emerged in recent years and how significant you see them as being.
Well, I hate to admit to being such a stumbling old man that I'm not familiar with Twitter. Sorry.
Well, I think that actually that is like the Facebook and these are the social networks that are not necessarily aimed at problem solving, but just where people are getting networked together. So that, I think that, yeah.
I mean, not to speak for Doug, but just looking at but I'm going to speak about the philosophical framework, is that really the philosophical framework is much deeper than sort of the Twitter mentality. That Twitter may be a small component, but it's really about looking at these complex problems and having a way to tag data. I mean, I think that the notion of hashtags, et cetera, is a step forward, but it's lacking the fundamental foundation, which is the intent of solving complex problems collectively in a complex, I mean, the answer can't be in a twit, or a tweet. It has to be in a serious framework.
Maybe we could finish up with having Doug talk a little bit about collective IQ, since that would seem to be the next step, just a little bit about raising collective IQ.
Oh, do I get to go?
Yeah, go.
Gee, I grew up in a family where somehow I felt like I had to have very special flags to say, okay, you can talk now. Well, I go back with the invention of common language, and then the invention of writing and printing and publishing, and leading up to the invention of, I guess, the internet, such as that. All those were stages that helped us be able to share our thoughts when I kind of came up with the idea of links, where you could actually make a comment and point right to the passage that you're trying to refer to, and then backlinks in which when you're reading that you can see that there are other people who are pointing at it. Oh, what does this guy have to say? What does that guy have to say? That this would provide for a much enhanced dialogue capability. And I guess I don't know whatever happened to that, the ability to see what's being pointed to by other people's links, and the ability to go back and see what those links talk to, or the body of writing or something in which those links were encased. Is that possible today?
I mean, it could be possible. It's not standard practice.
Anyway.
So maybe there could be a group here of technologists that might work on this, developing this idea of, anyone here who might volunteer? You don't have to volunteer today. Just commit the rest of your life.
Anyway, it seems to me there's a lot of potential in taking off in that kind of way.
Is there any words of wisdom that you want to impart to this group of educational technologists, as you had to say, well, what was the one thing you should definitely know?
Why? I guess I'd be really curious to know what the current dialogue in schools, what it's like to be dialoguing about how knowledge can be connected, interlinked, and enriched, and so I don't know what the current status of teaching is. Can you tell me?
I think it's so dispersed that there's no coherent picture. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yes. Although I will share with you on an ending note, about 15 years ago, I said to Doug, here I am struggling my way through this multimedia, and you've had already, 40-some years of experience in this field. What can you tell me is the single most important thing that's going to help me keep my focus? And he said, well, you never know which of your ideas are going to stick around and be long-lasting. And so, some of them are good, and some will continue, but you don't know which ones. So make sure that everything you do is as modular as possible, so that you can use those pieces in the future.
You sure it was in there?
Yeah. Sign up. We're actually finishing the second edition or the first edition of our Unbook, which is sort of a summary of our dialogues with Doug as well as other collaborators. And if you're interested in getting a copy in mid-July, you can sign up there. And we also have a blog called Engelbart Book Dialogues.
And the mural's online, you'll get a link to that.
Oh, yes, and we also have the Engelbart Mural online.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug.